Welcome to one of the last wild places in North America. This is British Columbia, Canada. It is here that the Wet'suwet'en people manage the forests and the salmon fisheries that inhabit some 22,000 square kilometers west of the Canadian Rockies.
In our stories, it says that this river, Wet'suwet'en, is the lifeblood of our history, of our people, of our land. Without the water, who are we?
For the Wet'suwet'en, living off the land reinforces what parents and children can accomplish together in a life cycle of birth to death. They celebrate both equally through ancient customs like this one. On this day, the Wet'suwet'en gather for a burial ceremony to remember a fallen friend. The tug of war between clans represents the struggle to live and the eventual surrender to the afterlife.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
The Wet'suwet'en see business the same way. Instead of welcoming industries like mining, logging, and fishing, which peter out once the resource is exhausted, they choose to manage the life cycle of development, one industry at a time.
We're not anti-industry, but we will control what will happen on our territory and at what pace.
Out on the Pacific Ocean, Haisla Nation member Gerald Amos observes the damage the industrial boom-bust cycle has left among his people when the local paper mill closed.
You know, Eurocan was here for less than 40 years. They made a lot of money. They created 300 or 400 or 500 jobs. And one day it became uneconomical and they moved on. You know, took with them 500 jobs.
Now, just across the bay, a new industry looms on the horizon. Pipeline company Enbridge has proposed the Northern Gateway Pipeline. It would travel 1,200 kilometers across First Nation land from the oil sands in Fort McMurray, Alberta, to the port of Kitimat, British Columbia.
The port of Kitimat here behind me makes a lot of sense as the destination point for the Enbridge pipeline. It's a deep water port that doesn't freeze over in the winter. But even more important than that is the fact that it's closer to Shanghai, China than either of the ports in either Vancouver, British Columbia or San Francisco, California.
So far, Asia has been a largely untapped market for Canadian oil producers. Right now, they sell more than 99% of their oil to the United States for less money than they could get on the global oil market.
So it's critical that we get another customer so that we can get world-class prices for our most important export.
John Carruthers is the president of Enbridge's Northern Gateway Pipeline. It's his job to convince Canadians and their government to approve this critical link to a growing market that could allow Canadian oil companies to get a better price for their product. Canadian oil companies are counting on him.
Canada right now is the single largest supplier of crude oil to the United States, but it makes sense for us to diversify those markets into Asian markets, etc. That's going to ensure that we get the best price for our product. That means we're maximizing tax revenues, crown royalties, economic benefits for all Canadians.
But nearly a decade after it was initially proposed, Northern Gateway is caught up in red tape and public suspicion.
You don't think that your investors are concerned about the length of time it's taking to get this project approved?
I think we're all concerned about, well, one, how long will it take and what will the decision be? I think that's just, I mean, that is the process we're going through.
Canada's federal government is expected to make a final decision by mid-2014, after 18 months of public hearings. While Enbridge says about 2/3 of the Aboriginal people groups that live along the pipeline's proposed path have accepted a 10% equity offer in the project, dozens of other so-called First Nations in British Columbia have banded together against it. On Wet'suwet'en territory, the message is clear.
Let's have a moment's silence. They're gone. It will never be contemplated by the Wet'suwet'en that if or when, it's a done deal.
John Ridsdale, also called Chief Namox, has officially banned all pipelines from Wet'suwet'en territory. He's taken his message to boardrooms, the National Review Panel, and even Enbridge investors.
And the Wet'suwet'en have told them, your money will sit there and it will rot because the project will not happen.
Alex Pietrella leads the Regional Industrial Development Society. He says Kitimat needs to welcome industry to improve the area's roads, education, and health care.
If we don't develop our resources and if we don't develop our economy, will one day stand there without the royalties and revenues that we need to feed the demands of society.
Somebody has to say no at some point. You know, the Kalamazoo, a perfect example. Nobody said enough of the no, and look what happened there.
In July 2010, an Enbridge pipeline burst, dumping nearly 3.2 million liters of heavy oil into the Kalamazoo River in the northern United States. It took 17 hours before it was discovered. While more than 5.6 million liters of oil has now been recovered, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, estimates there are still more than 605,000 liters remaining, nearly 200,000 gallons.
I would think we would have recovered well over 90% of that oil. And I haven't read that latest.
The current that they're still trying to get out of the bottom of the river is close to 200,000.
Well, it would not be, again, in looking at the barrels, you can get the vast majority of that oil out.
What would you say Enbridge has learned from that that's informed its ability to make this pipeline safer?
Yes, so again, it was a very humbling experience for Enbridge, very tragic in terms of an incident that affected a waterway. So you look at that and say, how do we avoid that going forward?
Enbridge says Northern Gateway will be able to detect a spill immediately and shut it down within 10 minutes. And if there is a problem, the pipeline will have 10 round-the-clock staffed pump stations for a quicker response.
We can't guarantee that there won't be a spill, but that's why you go to such great assurances and learnings from what was happening.
That's where the Enbridge terminal would be.
Gerald Amos worries more about the potential for an oil spill as tankers approach the port.
It's a disaster in the making. Just the amount of rocks. I mean, it's riddled with reefs, and you know, and the windstorms that are out there are unparalleled, yeah, in terms of wave size and just the sheer force of the wind.
In response, Enbridge has mandated a tanker certification program, 2 pilots per tanker as guides, and 2 tugs to escort every loaded tanker.
If it can be built safely, this in itself, the innovation in that, the technology in that, the engineering knowledge in that, all that alone will become a product for the Canadian energy industry by itself.
Despite adding millions of dollars in safeguards, Enbridge could still have to find its mandate to build Northern Gateway in court.
I don't think that there are many First Nations that could afford it. However, I think that there's so much passion around this issue that there are a lot of people who are prepared to fundraise.
Are you going to stick it out?
You've seen that we're very committed, but we're very committed for 2 basic reasons. One, it's a fundamental need for Canadians to get full value for its resources. The second is we believe it can be built and operated safely.
Yet Wall Street firms Goldman Sachs and Standard & Poor's are hedging their bets. Both have issued reports saying the oil sands production targets can't be met without additional pipelines.
One analyst coined the phrase stranded assets for the oil sands. Do you believe that you could become stranded here in Alberta?
I don't believe that. Like I say, markets are persistent, and markets are ultimately the masters.
Until that pipeline infrastructure is in place, more and more Canadian oil is moving to rail.
The industry has already responded with that rail transportation that 5 years ago you wouldn't have thought would happen.
Rail transport has dangers of its own, as Canadians learned in July 2013 when a train carrying more than 7.5 million liters of light crude oil spilled in Lake Megantic, Quebec. 47 people died in the explosions and fires that followed. But North America is still a continent with the world's highest energy consumption, and its lack of oil reserves has made it dependent on foreign nations. China, Russia, and India aren't far behind North America in oil consumption and represent a hugely lucrative market for Canada. In the face of that demand, Canadian oil sands companies are at a crossroads, some bogged down in pipeline politics, all seeking to strike a balance between profit margins and public safety. The stakes are all too clear.